In the first day of this unit, we looked at early 15th century Florence and the birth of what is usually termed the early Italian Renaissance. Today, confusingly, we're going to jump back in time and look at a period that is sometimes referred to as late Italian Gothic and sometimes referred to as the Proto Renaissance. You saw a hint of this period with your brief glimpse of a Giotto fresco, and it's to Giotto we'll return now. But first, let me give you a little background. Italy took a somewhat different path through the Middle Ages than the rest of Europe. Remnants of the Roman Empire lived on more strongly there, and of course, Italian artists could study Roman sculpture firsthand. The areas of Europe that would eventually become France and Germany were ruled by kingdoms, the larger empires of the Carolingians and then Ottonians, and the smaller kingdoms that arose as these empires disintegrated and reformed. Italy, by contrast, was a collection of city-states. Some, like Naples and Milan, were basically small kingdoms, but others, including Florence and Siena, where we'll be hanging out today, were republics. Now, that does not mean that they were democracies. These city-states were all oligarchies, that is, they were ruled by the wealthy few. The Medici video gave you a glimpse into this world. It was in Italy that the first great work of literature in vernacular or commonly spoken language appeared. That was Dante's Divine Comedy. And as Byzantium came under more and more threat from the Ottoman Turks, remember the fall of Constantinople, Greek scholars fled to Italy and brought with them Greek classical texts that had largely disappeared from Western Europe. This altarpiece is painted in what was dubbed at the time the Maniera Greca, or Greek manner, and what art historians now call the Italo-Byzantine style. It was, as you might expect, heavily influenced by those immigrants who were fleeing Byzantium and who brought their art and artistic techniques with them. We are not going to talk much about Italo-Byzantine art since it has disappeared from the College Board list. But let's take a moment for review. What Byzantine features do you observe in this altarpiece? Well, the figure of St. Francis is fully frontal and elongated. He has that long, thin Byzantine nose and the wide, staring eyes. His feet seem to be floating on the surface, and the space he occupies is linear and flat. It's really not a three-dimensional space. The gold leaf indicates the saint's otherworldly state, which is a little ironic for the very down-to-earth St. Francis, while the accompanying images tell the stories from his life. In other words, this looks a lot like an icon. Let me make one interesting historical and theological note. We're going to be looking at a lot of altarpieces in the next few days. Until Vatican II, priests generally celebrated Mass ad orientem, that is, with their faces to the east, which, given the orientation of most apses, meant with their backs to the congregation. Altarpieces came into fashion partly to give congregations something to contemplate during Mass besides the priest's posterior. But the real reason I included this non-required work is to talk about the Franciscans, a religious order that, along with another teaching order, the Dominicans, transformed religious life first in Italy and then throughout Europe. This painting dates from only 9 years after St. Francis's death, a testament to the immediate and enormous impact this saint had on Christendom. I think most of you know about St. Francis, how he renounced his considerable worldly goods, how he preached respect for God's natural creation. In Italy, huge congregations flocked to hear St. Francis and his followers preach, and huge churches were built to accommodate them. Rejecting abstract symbolism and complex theology, Franciscans preached in stories that brought the gospel quite literally down to earth. And of course, they were preaching in a pre-literate age, so one of the best ways to tell the stories was in pictures. So here are a couple of the most famous scenes from St. Francis's life, again from an Italo-Byzantine altarpiece that you just saw. Again, recall that this painting is very soon after the saint's death. You all know the story of St. Francis preaching to the birds, right? And here he is receiving the stigmata, or wounds of Christ. So, on the left you see a famous painting by Giotto, less than 70 years later. It's not a required work, but Giotto's paintings are so distinctive, so recognizable, and so important that they're real favorites for College Board attribution questions. So, what differences do you see between the two depictions of the same scene? the Italo-Byzantine version on the right and the Proto Renaissance GIotto version on the left. Well, Giotto's St. Francis actually has a body underneath his cloak. His figure has mass and weight. Both he and the figure of Christ have very human faces. The landscape, while not precisely naturalistic, note the sky is still gold, bears a much closer resemblance to nature. But the painting is still largely iconographic and stylized. We haven't arrived at the Renaissance yet. But what really stands out to me, what made Giotto such a perfect artist for the Franciscans, is that this is a very human St. Francis. We see his wonder. We see his fear. This is a saint we might encounter in the street or in the fields, a godly man to be sure, but still a man. I've clipped the face from the Berlinghieri altarpiece and stuck it in the upper right-hand corner just to help you make the comparison. The Byzantine elements and departure from Byzantine elements become clearer when you compare this Italo-Byzantine Madonna on the left by Giotto's teacher, Cimabue, with our Byzantine Theotokos, or Mother of God icon, one of our required works. So, what similarities and differences do you see? Well, there are a lot of facial similarities, including the narrow face and nose, the use of gold for all this stylized formality. Yet for all this stylized formality, I think Cimabue's work is a little less forbidding. This is the Gothic Mary, more human and approachable. But that comparison is still far less striking than the comparison between Cimabue and his famous student Giotto. There are obviously a lot of similarities in theme and composition here, but what differences do you notice? Well, the architecture of Giotto's throne comes a little closer to spatial reality. It actually wraps around the Madonna, enclosing her. Her head is upright, which is a break from the Byzantine tradition. She's looking right at us, engaging us in the moment. The angels are likewise more varied and seem to stand more clearly on a ground plane. The overlapping gives a greater sense of depth. And above all, Mary has a real body. We actually see the curve of her breasts and her knee poking out. Neither painting is set in an earthly realm, but again, it's easier to locate ourselves in the Giotto universe. We're standing below Christ, looking up. Cimabue's figures, by contrast, seem mostly to float in space. And again, what really stands out to me is the human emotion of Giotto's Mary. She's almost smiling. She seems almost ready to speak to us. Both painters use chiaroscuro to show modeling, but Giotto's Mary has more volume, more depth. This is a good point to have a quick discussion about painting techniques. So what medium was used to create the Theotokos icon? It's not shown here. The medium is encaustic, that is wax mixed with pigment so that it would stick to wood. By late Gothic times, painters were more likely to use egg-based tempera, which also adhere to wood. These paintings are mostly on wood altarpieces. Tempera produced brilliant colors, but it also dried very quickly, and this posed some real challenges to painters. Oil paint, which we'll encounter soon, dries more slowly. It's easier to blend and apply in layers. So oil paintings are not as reliant on line to define shapes and to establish volume. Note that Cimabue Madonna essentially uses the gold lines to define the drapery. Giotto's more realistic drapery is shaped by light and shadow. And again, we see highlights on Mary's breasts, emphasizing her role as a mother and giving her body more volume. Okay, we're finally honing in on our required work. I am not going to give you much background about the Arena Chapel, since I am assuming you watched the Khan Academy videos about this extraordinary masterpiece, and you're about to watch another. The Arena Chapel was built in Padua, which was another of the Italian trading cities that accumulated great wealth in this period. These photos show the two ends of the chapel. One has the Last Judgment, and the other the Annunciation. So at this point, we're going to go back to Sister Wendy. Caught her at a rather awkward moment there, didn't I? And a longer video clip, which will give you a close-up look at several of the paintings in the chapel, including our required work, the Lamentation. And we need to get on to our required image, but first, let's take a quick look at a few more of the images from the Arena Chapel. I've mentioned Giotto's close association with the Franciscans and their emphasis on Christian narratives anchored in the everyday lives of people. What kind of narrative details do you see in this painting? Well, Giotto really captures the drama of people removing their cloaks by showing it in 3 sequential figures, set up also on a diagonal line to grab our attention and create drama. And I love the men climbing the tree for a better view. Here is a scene from the upper panel, the life of Anna and Joachim, Mary's parents, taken from medieval literature. In this scene, Mary's father, Joachim, is visited in a dream by an angel who announces the coming birth of a child. Now, if you saw this image on an AP test, what clues would identify it as Giotto? And by the way, a question along those lines has appeared several times in the past. Well, again, you note the modeling. We see a real volume in these figures. We see a use of chiaroscuro to show light and shadow. I especially like the way Giotto uses highlights to give Joachim a butt. The angel's dynamism is heightened by foreshortening, and again we see more emotion in these faces. I'm not even bothering to label this scene, you all recognize it. Here we see Mary, young and tender, reaching for a baby who looks almost like a real baby. So what unusual device does Giotto use to draw us into this painting, to put us right in front of the scene? We see it in the Lamentation as well. The figures with the backs to the viewer are a Giotto innovation, and again they draw us into the picture plane. Note that we're still looking up. We're standing below Mary and the Christ child, as seems appropriate. So what's wrong with the depiction of the space? Well, we see Joseph in front of Mary, but he's smaller. The mountains are too flat. Giotto's landscapes tend to be stylized and idealized, but we're still moving somewhat toward realism. I love this painting. Here again we see the intense emotion, the narrative drama, the use of chiaroscuro, and especially highlighting to capture volume and space. Notice that all of these faces are different. These aren't just sort of standard Byzantine saintly faces lined up. They're showing expression and different kinds of expression. But what I really love about this image is how Giotto uses the spears and torches to add diagonal drama to the scene. Okay, finally we get to our required work. What's going on in the panel on the left, and why is it there? The narrative paintings in the Arena Chapel are separated by decorative panels that imitate architectural columns, but also juxtapose Old and New Testament stories. And this is a very familiar juxtaposition. We see Jonah being swallowed by a whale. He stayed in the whale for 3 days, and that is interpreted as prefiguring Christ's death, entombment, and after 3 days, his resurrection. Oops. The wrong direction. There we go. You've heard a lot about this image, and we're going to run out of time, but what I'd like to focus on for a few minutes is style. What techniques does Giotto use to build this painting? How is it composed? How does he use line and color? How does he create a sense of three-dimensional space in a two-dimensional image? Take a few minutes to talk about what you see and how Giotto uses the elements of form to put his message across and to draw us into the painting. Well, I hope you had a good discussion. I'm going to make a few observations, but these are points you may already have made. So the painting contains a dramatic diagonal that leads our eye up to that solitary dead tree, which represents the fatal tree of the knowledge of good and evil in Eden, whose curse is about to be overcome by Christ's death and resurrection. The diagonal also leads us down to the focal point, really the climax of the composition, the grieving Mary holding her son. Giotto has varied the postures of the figures, adding interest and drama. He also uses complementary colors to draw our eye. So Mary Magdalene's red skirt is juxtaposed with the cloak of the figure beside her with its back to us. The blue and orange of the figures immediately above are also contrasting colors. The astonishing blues of the Arena Chapel, by the way, reflected the patron's specific desires and also his wealth, which he was probably showing off even as he was repenting the sin of usury. The patron wanted the chapel to be painted in a brilliant blue to create that illusion of the sky reflecting the heavens, but note, not a Byzantine gold heaven. Blue was also the color traditionally associated with Mary's cloak, and this was very much a chapel dedicated to the Virgin. Remember, the top panels are all about the life of Mary and her parents. So how do you get this blue? The pigment was made by grinding up lapis lazuli from the Middle East, and a very expensive material, but it produced a gorgeous color. This cobalt blue couldn't be applied directly to wet plaster, however. The plaster would absorb too much of the expensive pigment and it would soften and blur the color. So, Giotto, again, following the instructions of his patron who wanted the blue, mixed it with egg yolks and applied it on top of the dried frescoes. That's known as secco fresco or dry fresco. The paint did not bind as well and began to peel. Stay tuned for the Last Supper. So I didn't assign the Khan Academy video on the Last Judgment panel in the Arena Chapel, although, of course, I always think it's good to watch more of them. Unlike the Lamentation, this is not considered one of Giotto's greatest works, and in fact, art historians think much of it was painted by his assistants. But there are a couple of elements we should note, if only in passing. The Arena Chapel's patron, Scrovegni, features prominently among the saved. Giotto knew who was writing his paycheck. Here we see the patron presenting the chapel to the three Marys. And it wouldn't be a Last Judgment without a deliciously scary devil and depiction of hell, would it? But on a more technical note, why does this look like a patchwork quilt? At least a little. Frescoes had to be painted quickly before the plaster dried. A giornate was the portion that a painter could complete in a day, and that was the amount of wet plaster that was applied. A giornate, skilled fresco painters learned how to disguise the daily divisions, often with architectural features, but in fact, they can usually be identified in a painting. The rather obvious giornate here may be a reason why art historians think that most of this was painted by assistants. Another feature of the Arena Chapel are the series of paintings of vices and virtues along the bottom. Here we see injustice on the left. By the way, interestingly enough, the only male figure, and of course usury was considered to be a form of injustice, and then justice on the right. These are painted in gray tones, and that's called grisaille. It imitates sculpture, and it's used to enhance the visual trickery, trompe d'oeil or fool the eye, which is part of the Arena Chapel and many other things that we're going to see. This is just the kind of detail that the College Board might hit you with, and in fact the term grisaille shows up in at least one question that you've seen. The virtues and vices are actually closely related to the biblical narratives. They're very carefully placed, but alas, I just don't have time to go there. I don't have time to go to Siena either, but I'm going to anyway, even though the College Board has, rather shockingly to my mind, dropped the wonderful Proto Renaissance paintings of Siena entirely from its list. I personally have a soft spot for Siena. The summer after my junior year in college, I had an internship with the UN in Geneva, Switzerland. On weekends, I used a student rail pass to travel around Switzerland, Italy, France, Holland, etc. I'd sleep on the train to save money, and that's also how I could travel so far afield. Anyway, a friend of mine, who was really a friend of a friend, was spending the 6 months before he started law school backpacking through Europe. He sent me a postcard from Siena and suggested I check it out. He knew I was in Europe that summer. He said Siena is even more amazing than Florence and a lot less crowded. I found this hard to believe, at least the more amazing than Florence part, but on his advice, I went to Siena the next weekend and I loved it. I wrote back to this friend of a friend and said he had excellent taste. Would he like to join me on one of my weekend jaunts? We met up in Antwerp, Belgium, and spent most of our time wandering around its splendid art museums looking at Flemish art. We also got to know each other better that weekend, and I've now been married to the guy for 36 years. But since the College Board is not requiring me to describe Sienese painting in any detail, I am going to let Sister Wendy do the work. She's going to introduce you to my two favorite Sienese painters, who used to show up all the time on the AP Art History exam, and to two very important paintings. The Maesta altarpiece, probably the most famous single work in Siena, and the Parable of the Good Government, which is in the fresco in the city hall. This is actually also a parable of bad government, as you'll see. And I like this discussion because it focuses on the particular political structure of the Italian city-states, which, as I argued in yesterday's lecture, is very important to the way that the Renaissance began. Hey, I love Sister Wendy. I own several of her books. I've watched the entire Story of Painting series several times, but she is deliciously easy to parody. So as a final treat, meet Sister Randy.